Welcome back to The Conservative. How are you today? And this is Mike Lannon, your host, and we're taping today on PEG TV. You all should try to counter some of my arguments by coming down and having your own show. They always like to have new perspectives, new people giving shows, so welcome aboard. Today I want to talk a little bit about tolerance because one of the things that I've noticed a great deal about going on in this country right now is the lack of tolerance, the inability to have political speech without somebody yelling at you. I saw a rally just recently here in the Rutland area where people were yelling profanities out of the window, chucking fingers at each other, doing all kinds of things that normal people don't do. And I, being of the age that I am, can tell you that in the past, political discourse, even though there were impasses to be explored, the attempt to build shared meaning was there, and we would try to come to at least some kind of an agreement, if nothing more than to agree to disagree. But we certainly didn't chuck fingers at each other. We certainly didn't yell profanities at each other. We certainly didn't try to tear the person across from us down into the abyss, a nasty, dirty sewer hole of some type. We didn't do that kind of stuff. And yet now in the last 20 years, and in particular the last 8 years, and now even more so the last 4 years with President Trump, we've got that kind of stuff going on. People are not going to move the country forward when they cannot build a shared meaning and come to some form of compromise. And that's exactly what tolerance does. It's a word that we hear a lot these days, so I'm going to try to define it from my perspective anyway. And I think basically tolerance is the ability to live with people whose opinions and behavior you don't agree with. That's tolerance. And there's lots of people that you're not going to necessarily like in this world. You're going to dislike them. I do not advocate that you come to the position of hate. That's a very bad place to be because you're wearing their problems on your shoulders. You're not going to necessarily like everybody, but if you follow the great commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of your heart and mind, body, and soul, and you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. There's the second great commandment, and that's the thing that you should be striving for, is to try to find common meaning so that you can like and then perhaps love your neighbor. Not love in the agape sense, the deep sense of romantic love, or love the agape meaning the love of God. That's a different ballgame, but the love of a neighbor, the love of a person, you can certainly bring it down to like and dislike. You can like your neighbor, try to do the best you can with them. So that's essentially that the ability to live with people whose opinions and behavior you don't agree with is essentially the Oxford Dictionary definition. And certainly it's the way the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it. And we as a society have always defined it, quite frankly. So you might be for the death penalty and your cousin might be against it. That's certainly a difference of opinion. You might be against the $15 minimum wage, and your coworker might be all for it. There's a difference. How do you build a shared meaning between those two opinions? Your dad might have voted for Trump, your mom might have voted for Hillary Clinton, and your brother may not have voted at all. So that becomes another differences of opinion, and how do you go about tolerating those who voted, those who didn't, those who voted differently than you. In America, you're supposed to have that freedom. You're supposed to have the ability to have political discourse. You're supposed to have the ability to be politically sensitive, but not politically insensitive and call people names. Whatever the differences we have, tolerating others' opinions is a prerequisite to a functioning and free society. You have to have that tolerance. And political tolerance is an important virtue to have. We've got to start cultivating that. We've got to start building on that, or we are going to bring ourselves to the sewer, to the abyss, and we're not going to come back over it. We're going to drop over the precipice, and we're going to be so partisan that we can't come up with any kind of a built shared meaning. We're never going to explore impasses, so therefore we're never going to have compromises. You got to remember that America itself was built on a foundation of tolerance. We literally, we grew from a nation of people that were tolerant of each other, different religions, different backgrounds, farmers, lawyers, engineers, doctors, sat there in that room, the founding fathers. And if you think about the Declaration of Independence, it guarantees us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's an implicit contract there. And that implicit contract is to have your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. You have to be tolerant of somebody else's life, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. Because someone's pursuit of all of these things, that the guarantees of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are certainly different than maybe and perhaps yours. And so you can see that over the years of tolerance of different issues that have come up for the last 50 years have been right from pro-life to pro-death. Those are two absolutely different opinions, obviously. So this contract, this social contract that was called the Constitution of the United States, a democratic republic, not a democracy, folks, a democratic republic. This contract that was made and founded as a constitution with three separate branches, equal branches of government, not to be legislated from the Supreme Court bench as a part of the legislative process, but to adjudicate that which is written by the president and which is mostly written, or should be totally written, by the House of Representatives and the Senate, not by the president and not by the Supreme Court. So this thing about packing the court is an absolute abysmal divide. It's going to tear the nation further apart if the Democrats ever get a chance to do that, and they certainly have threatened to. Hopefully that's just political talk, but if they get in there and they put 15, 17, 19 people on the court, whereas for the last 150 to 170 years it's been 9, that's a really good number, according to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That seemed like a workable number. The more people you have on a committee, the less likelihood you have of coming up with any kind of a solution. But you don't want judges legislating law from the bench. You want them to adjudicate law. You want them to look at law and read it as, of course, from my conservative point of view, you want them to read it as the Constitution is written. So that's a constructionist, not a person that writes it the way they see it and move it down the road with a moving, living document. So this contract, though, has really become broken down from my perspective. If you listen to the mainstream media, which is as corrupt as some of the government officials that we have down there in Washington, the only one side is living up to its deal is the left side. And that's not at all possibly true. We've got scandals going on in both the Democratic and Republican parties. The big one right now is going on in the in the Democratic Party, because we've got all the way back to the false dossier that brought Trump into 3.5 years of hell from the media for charges that have been proven to be absolutely totally wrong, total lies, all the way to the current Hunter Biden scandal with the billions of dollars that have been taken from communist nations or former communist nations, and certainly would wonder what that peddling of influence dollars were buying. But in the government of a free democratic republic, the selling of influence is a treasonable offense, and you could go to jail, if not be killed for that. In the old-fashioned way with a firing squad, I doubt if anything like that will happen. I always find it very interesting that what's going on in Washington never seems to have any consequences. Those of us that are sitting here that are the normal Americans, the only consequence that we can deliver is a vote out. Vote them out. That's the only way that you can change the government down there, is to exercise your 4-year right and your 2-year right when you go to congressional offices, et cetera. But your 4-year right to change the presidency, change partially the Senate, change partially the House of Representatives, you got to get rid of these people. That's why people are scrambling around saying we need term limits, because somehow or another this power down there in Washington is corrupting people, and it's just not right. We'll lose this country if we allow people to peddle influence or sell favors for what they're doing in Washington, D.C. And it appears, based on what I see as I'm sitting here today, it appears that that is what's happened. Whether or not we're going to get huge press coverage from it remains to be seen. That's why the press is considered corrupt by many Americans today, because the press does not report the news. And there's two sides of a news story. There's the side that I deliver as an opinion piece. I let you know this is an editorial piece. This is opinion. It's not always based totally on fact or just news fact, okay? I try to base it on facts, so I don't want to just exclude the fact that I'm not using facts, which I do. I research this. But you have to be a discerning consumer. You have to say, is Mike Lannon correct or is he wrong? I have lots of people that come to me and say, gee, I wish you'd said it this way or I wish you'd said it that way. Of course, lots of Monday morning quarterbacks. But the bottom line is that this is an opinion show. And when I read the newspaper, which are dying in this country, fastest growing newspaper in the United States is the Wall Street Journal. There's a new newspaper out there that I've seen. It's circulated for some here in the Rutland area called Epic Times. It'll be interesting to see if that gets any traction at all, but certainly the local newspaper, the Rutland Herald, has really suffered because they don't report both sides of the news, and they don't deliver editorials on both sides, and most people want to read both sides of the news. Now, if you go back to the 1920s, that decade, and the 1930s, that decade, the Rutland Herald presented all kinds of news, both sides. They had a burgeoning readership. They had a lot of subscribers, and that's been falling off year after year after year for every newspaper in this country. Why? Because one, people aren't reading? No, people are still reading. They're getting their news off the internet now, and you're going to find that after this, well, it's going to depend right now in this next election. If the Republican president, who is currently running for another term of office, President Trump, if he gets reelected, watch the legislative process begin to investigate Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, these accounts that are taking down people's opinion pieces and even some news pieces. And that is basically in violation of the Freedom of Press Act, even though they have this freedom to be just a platform delivery. Once you have this freedom called I think it's called the 120 access plan, but once that freedom is abused, that freedom should be taken away, and it should no longer become a platform, but it should be then considered the press, and therefore only have the protections that the free press has, which would mean that the free press, when they tell lies, can be sued and lose big money. The most recent case, millions of dollars by CNN and CBS to the young kid from Kentucky who they wrote very bad stories about when the Native American was beating his tom-tom in front of him, and the young kid had on a President Trump MAGA hat, and he just stood there, and the press vilified him all the way up to even the bishop of the school that he was in Kentucky. It was a Catholic school. They were down visiting Washington, D.C. But that young man is now, because of the right to sue the press for lies, has won millions of dollars. The first case, the CNN case, was for $250 million, and they settled that, and you know that the lawyer that worked for him didn't settle for $50, so maybe half. But CBS, they got sued for more than $250 million, and that case has also been settled. So this kid is sitting really, really, really well for the violation of freedom of the press. So you want to know the right, according to the media, is intolerant of everyone, except those darned white heterosexual Christian males. I mean, you hear that all the time. Mr. Biden, the former vice president running for president, said the same thing that Hillary said, different word, but she called everybody in the 2016 election deplorable. It hurt her in the last 2 weeks of the election. And then, as I sit here today, 2 days ago, former Vice President Joe Biden called people that were outside his arena, that were not participating in his rally, but they were walking peacefully outside the arena for Trump. He called them chumps. So, you know, he didn't say it just once, he said it 2 or 3 times, and sure enough, that's going to haunt him, because you can't call people names and expect it to not come back and haunt you. Deplorable went out into America. The word chumps is out there now. It's going to hurt that man's chances to become president of the United States. So we're crazy to be intolerant, both sides. There's only one problem. It isn't true that the right isn't tolerant. Actually, there's evidence out there that the right is more tolerant than the left. Right now, as far as I can see, the left is burning down the cities and rioting and destroying stores and looting. I don't see people on the right doing that. So incredibly, the left isn't even tolerant of the very people they say they're tolerant of. If you're gay or black or an immigrant and you're not in lockstep with the current leftist orthodoxy, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I've seen that on TV. Mr. Biden yelled at a black commentator back in, I think it was early June, where it might have been July, where he said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Well, what a thing to say to somebody. You know, the commentator was a black man doing a nice interview. Then he questioned some of the things that Biden had done in the past for and against blacks, and Biden went after him. That was a big mistake. It's going to hurt him in this election. So if you believe you should judge people on the content of their character and not the color of their skin, the left calls you a racist. Okay, so to me, that's so bad. You know, who cares what the color of a person's skin is? Who cares about their choices of gender and all these other things? Check what's in their heart. You've heard me say this before. There's 2 kinds of races of people: indecent people and decent people. Associate with decent people. And if the person that's next to you is an indecent person, tell them so and ignore them. You stay away from them. Walk away from them. Don't even receive them into your house. Don't even greet them. For whoever does greet them, you're basically sharing in the evil that they do. So don't do that. You know, don't be part of that. So if you believe that America is a nation of immigrants, but that our country should also protect its borders, the left calls you a xenophobe. If you believe that men and women are equal but fundamentally different, the left calls you a sexist. Sorry, but men and women are different. I do believe that the border should be protected. We're one of the only nations in the world that doesn't have a border. Okay? We don't want tons and tons of illegal people crossing into our border. Number one, we can't control them. And number two, we can't control the numbers if it's free, open borders. And number two, we can't afford it. We cannot afford to give your money to people who are coming into the country with no skill set and coming in illegally. That's not the way it works in the world. And I don't care if the Pope does say that we should have all open borders worldwide. That's a fantasy. That's not going to happen. Why don't we tell that to China? Why don't you try to get into China? Even better than that, why don't you try to get out of China? Why don't you try to get into the former Soviet Union, now known as Russia? Let's see you get in there and get out. How about Poland? All bordered. All those countries. Germany, all bordered. And boy, they wish they hadn't opened up their borders to the folks that were fleeing the terrorist groups back in the 80s and 90s. They wish they hadn't done it, because it's caused great problems in their countries. A orderly, organized, fashionable immigration policy is the way people should go. You can then control and you can have lots of people here, which is what America has done for years, and I'm not going to listen to these folks that wish to engage in the destruction of the culture by saying otherwise. Read the history books, and don't just read one history book written by a liberal professor that wrote it in 1990. Read the history books that are back there in the world when the history was being written by the folks that were living it. Okay, so that's an important statement. Read primary sources rather than just the person that's coming from a liberal university with a liberal spin on history. I was always taught when you read history, find the primary sources. Like, for instance, the Constitution of the United States. Read the Federalist Papers. That tells you what they were thinking. Most people have never even heard of the Federalist Papers. Most people have never even read it. So here's the thing. Those who only tolerate people they agree with or like aren't actually tolerant. So who is tolerant? Well, is it the organizers of the Women's March who had to apologize for the hurt and confusion they caused when they invited a man, leftist icon Bernie Sanders, to speak at their convention? I think that might have been a little wrong. Is it the Antifa thugs who caused UC Berkeley to spend $600,000 on security when mainstream conservative Ben Shapiro showed up to give a talk? That doesn't sound right. Or is it Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters who scolded Kanye West for talking out of turn when he dared suggest that blacks should think for themselves? Now, that's a black woman telling a black man that he's talking out of turn. That's just not tolerant. Those are three cases of non-tolerance. These aren't isolated examples either. I'm guessing that you, person watching this right now, have silenced yourself because you don't want to suffer the wrath of the outraged mob. That's why you have a silent majority about to vote. By the time I come back and do this show again, the election will be over. We'll see just how big that silent majority is. I think it's very large. Could be wrong. I don't have a hand on the pulse of the nation, but I think there's a huge number of people that are never going to tell a pollster how they're going to vote. They don't want the pressure from the left of being called everything under the sun, and you've just heard me say some of the words. So let me ask the question again. Who is tolerant? Well, here's the surprise. It's actually those scary right-wingers that the media and the university demonize every day. It's the conservatives, people like myself. I don't mind being called any name under the book because I don't get my hackles. I don't get the bristles on the back of my neck standing up as much as I used to when I was a young man. But I'll tell you right now, years ago, if you used the FU word on me and you'd use other expletives deleted, I would get really angry. And when in school, junior high, high school, we'd go behind the bleachers and duke it out. They don't do that kind of stuff anymore, I guess. I suspect they do. We just don't hear about it. The left, sadly, has become utterly intolerant of anyone with whom they disagree. And I witnessed that this weekend, yelling and screaming out of cars at other people, watching the New York City Jews for Trump, having a Jew dragged out of a car and beaten up, and having people throw rocks and ice bottles at people just because they had a different opinion. And I'm absolutely surprised that those folks that are of the Jewish faith who watched the slaughter of Jewish families under Hitler, under the same kind of Antifa, the same kind of fascist comments that were being thrown at them yesterday in Brooklyn, don't stand up and say enough is enough and vote differently. And I think you're going to find this coming election that blacks and Latinos are going to vote significantly differently because they've realized that the Democratic Party, the Socialist Democrats, are trying to control them and have tried to control them for years. So why do I say they're utterly intolerant? Well, because they believe that they know how you should live and how you should think. Any deviation, any nonconformity is dangerous to that goal. Believe it or not, the right these days actually welcomes diversity of thought. I can tell you that in the last few years of my political evolution, I've consistently found conservatives to be more tolerant and open-minded. Don't take my word for it, though. Test it out for yourself. Go talk to some. They do exist, and they do things like watch movies, travel and eat ethnic food, regular people things. You know what I found out? The right, much more than the left, believes in the notion of live and let live. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the true definition of tolerance. And as I conclude this show today, I want you to stop and think about whether or not you're tolerant. Are you of the political party that will yell and scream, chuck the finger, swear, expletives deleted, call your neighbor and all these other things, names that have absolutely no bearing on the political discourse? You're not going to win friends and influence people by yelling and screaming at somebody. It's just not going to happen. So everybody kind of knows that if they really stop and think about it. It'd be much better to sit down and have a political discourse with somebody. Yeah, you might walk away disagreeing to, or agreeing to disagree. You might not be able to explore the impasse completely, but I bet you if you were to sit down with someone that was willing to be with a growth mindset, willing to have an open mind, you just might come up with a compromise, a thought process that would move the political discourse forward rather than backward, to where you have this opinion of dislike, which is where we started this afternoon. What is dislike? What is hatred? What do we do to be non-tolerant of each other? And the only way that you're going to fix that is to be able to have a conversation that is civil and does not have associated with it discourse that has evil associated with it. And it's that simple. You know, you're not going to swear and yell at somebody and call them all kinds of names or try to drag their good name through the gutter and expect that somehow those folks are going to respect you and agree with you in any part of your argument. If you have an argument with me, and I don't mean a screaming and yelling argument, you just heard me say that's not going to win. But let's say we have a disagreement type argument where we are civil. It does not mean that I'm going to walk away taking away any part of what you're saying. However, with an open mind, as I described in my last few paragraphs, if you approach a conversation with an open mind, you can certainly come up with a discourse. And if you're really, really lucky, you just might get a metacognition. You just might get a ability to move the football down the field together. You don't think that all 11 men in a huddle on a football field agree every time with the quarterback's option or the quarterback's play or the coach's play. But they agree to work together to make the ball move effectively down the field. And they elect, usually the owner of the company, a quarterback. For 4 years ago, we elected a president of the United States that the left has been intolerant of from the day he took office. That's not what we're supposed to do. I don't recall, and I'm waiting for someone to express a different view, that we tore into President Obama the way that the left has torn into President Trump. We didn't do that. We agreed that to make a democratic republic work, that whoever is elected by the Electoral College, the majority of the elected in the Electoral College, not the majority of the people that vote, because that would mean that the people in New York City and the major cities would control all of the country. That means that Vermont, with its only 630,000 population, would never have a voice in Washington. That would mean that out of the 48 contiguous states and the 50 states total, only those states that had the greatest population would control the United States government. That would be California and New York. Those are both states that have a socialistic viewpoint. What happens to the rest of us that don't believe that that's the way we should go? That's why the founding fathers, in their brilliance, decided that we should have an electoral college, which meant that every state, after the vote, would have a voice in who got chosen based on their state's vote, who would be chosen as president of the United States. And of course, the left, being intolerant, wants to change that, wants every possibility of only having it to be a popular vote, which would have meant that Hillary Clinton would have been the president. That would have been totally wrong. She did not win the election based on the Constitution of the United States. And it is intolerant for anybody to step out there and think, okay, we don't have a president, we don't have a legitimate president, he didn't win it fair and square. better define that, because according to the 50 states that voted, he won by a considerable electoral college vote. Well, now it's time to vote again. It's 2020. By the time I get back here, the second administration of Trump will be either in or it will be out, and we'll have a new administration. I don't know which way, but the most important thing is you have to vote. Bye now. See you next time.